Welcome to the extras of the 30-Minute Kiss podcast. We put the X in extras, if you will. I am Big Steve, and alongside me, as usual, is my partner, Doc. Doc, how are you doing this morning?
Welcome. I have had my coffee and I am ready to go. Let's
Good.
do this. We're going to chat a little more about the debut album today.
Yep.
Just in case somebody would like to listen to a little more chatter about some of the deeper stuff on the album.
Absolutely. And I think we talked about that during the podcast that we just recently recorded for it. It was really difficult to not tangent off on all of our other additional thoughts and experiences related to this and just the whole music experience as a whole. And that's kind of where this was centered in, is why we wanted to do this. Was that the state of music nowadays is obviously changing in some cases for the better, and not necessarily in all the cases. It's not as much of the experience for me personally as it was growing up. And I think that the theatrics, the production, just the presentation that Kiss brought to the table was really influential for me. And that's kind of what was rooted in. Let's discuss that more, like the whole thing from beginning to end, the nuts and bolts, right?
Right. So in these extras segments, it's going to be fun because we get to dig in a little bit more about the album artwork, the instruments, the sounds of the instruments, types of instruments. Just being musicians, it's fun to dive into that kind of stuff. And possibly a few tidbits, because I know you've read several books on Kiss. I'm about halfway through the Unmasked. Is that what it's called? Behind the Mask.
Yep.
Behind the Mask. I'm about halfway through that. So maybe some tidbits and things that were done in interviews over the years and things like that. And once again, we're no experts, but we just like to chat about it. So let's hit it up.
I think so too. Yeah, I think that that'll be fun too as we advance further, because what I know is, for anyone who is a Kiss fan, they tend to know a lot of the basic trivia that's related to the early stuff, especially. But for our purposes, we're recording this in the end of 2023, so I'm still coming across new interviews that are just taking place in the last month from some of these former and current Kiss members. So you're getting new information and new insights and new perspectives that might not have been there from podcasts that were done 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm looking forward to that too. So the first thing I want to talk to you about there, Doc, is let's just talk about the experience of buying the Kiss record when it first came out. That was before our time, not by much, but a little bit before our time. So we didn't have the luxury of experience it brand new in a record store, when you really didn't have an understanding of who these guys were, unless you were in their region and saw them opening for bands and were aware of their kind of local cult following. What kind of an experience is that, going into a record store and the first thing that you see are these 4 makeup silhouettes against a black backdrop on a vinyl? Like what goes through your head when you see that?
I love that look. I mean, if I was a kid or a teenager in 74 when this was released, I would look at that and I would be just kind of in awe, because it wasn't done like that before. There was some bands that did a little bit of makeup here and there, but it was more of a feminine type of thing. It wasn't a full-on character.
Unless Alice Cooper would have been around that time, I think, right?
Yeah, he had been around probably 5-6 years, I think, at that time. But he was really the only one, and he didn't really even wear makeup. He had some eyeliner around his eyes and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't full
not like
on.
the New York Dolls or anything like that were.
Yeah. And he did kind of wear some costumes, and he's kind of the godfather of shock rock, I guess. But Kiss didn't necessarily set out to be shock rockers. I guess that wasn't their plan.
That's what I tell people too, that I did. That really doesn't even come up anymore. But for a long time, like Kiss, well, aren't they evil? Aren't they bad? It's shock, it's rock, it's whatever. Like, go back, just do me a favor, take 20 minutes and just even scan through their first album. Just listen, because half of that music is about as up-tempo and happy as you could possibly imagine. So it's
right. Name one evil song off the first album.
Outside of the ending of Black Diamond, which, if that's the only thing you hear, is the gradual slowdown and crashing, and other than that, right, everything else is just got a more of a up-tempo vibe.
Yeah, and honestly, Black Diamond is one of my favorite tunes, and I did mention that. And I didn't really, really listen to the lyrics until fairly recently
Mhm.
and read some interviews about what that actually is about. And there's kind of speculation by a lot of different fans over the years, but I think it was kind of revealed that it was about Paul and wandering down the street and seeing all the prostitutes and just seeing how New York was at that time. And it was just kind of rough around the edges and a little bit dangerous. And supposedly, and this is all speculation as far as I know, but supposedly Black Diamond was the name of a prostitute.
It sounds like it. Yeah.
Um, and some people have also speculated that Black Diamond is a term for some sort of drug
Hmm.
that they were using back in the 70s.
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm not a drug expert by any means, and I'm not an expert on prostitution. So
Yeah.
it's kind of what you piece together through interviews. So I guess if you were looking for something evil, that would be the only thing remotely
But that's
dark.
subjective, right?
It's just a commentary on what New York City was like at that time. It's not
Mhm.
evil or it's not satanic in any way. It's just a sort of a social commentary song, if that's what it's truly about.
And it's not even, I mean, it follows the format of kind of Paul's writing that he did for that album too. I mean, look at Strutter. That's an observational piece about, a specific woman and, how she's just everything, right? And that was his take a lot with that. And even in his later songs, a lot of it is just observational from his point of view. And, Paul really is, and I never really gave him enough credit growing up. I just, and I had nothing against him by any stretch, but I didn't really appreciate his level of songwriting ability up until the last few years. Because he's an excellent songwriter. So
Yeah. So Strutter, Black Diamond, maybe you could find something there, but I think it was maybe more of a your teenagers playing it loud in their bedroom and it's kind of noise compared to what parents had been listening to, because if you're a teenager in the 70s, I would imagine your parents were either early baby boomers or something like that, so they were listening to more of the malt shop type stuff.
yeah, yeah.
The Motown and maybe even earlier stuff than that.
But
So
then on that note too, if you were smart as a kid, you would, and I have to actually add this in because this is an interesting piece of trivia that I just learned last night that I didn't include because I didn't know it when we recorded our podcast for the first album. If you're a kid at that time and your parents were the type that listened to that, your smartest move would have been to put on Kissin' Time. I got to be 100% honest. I had no idea that was a cover until last night. I had no idea that was a cover song.
wow, I didn't know that until just now.
A 1950s track from Bobby Rydell, and I had to listen to it. I almost sent it to you last night when I was listening to it at 9:00. I got up briefly, and I was like, "You got to be kidding me!" And the lyrics are changed just slightly, just in a couple of areas, but that is a cover track. I had no idea. I'm embarrassed that I didn't know that, and I was talking it up that it was, I mean, everything else they said and we talked about was accurate in that it was the record company wanted them to put it out as part of a promotion type idea. But I thought that they wrote it and they didn't. Bobby Rydell.
So that's why it's so corny, and that's why it was one that I didn't like, and that was my "Please Don't Make Me Listen to It" song.
Yes. And
so that's really, really, really interesting.
It is, and it just dropped a couple of notches in my belt because I liked it enough because I thought that they were kind of, the proverbial screws to the head, and like they had to kick this cheesy song out, and for what they did, I thought that they wrote and pieced together a good album. The fact that it's just a straight up cover is like, no, and it's so it is what it is, but I just figured I'd share that with you. So this is the type of stuff you're going to get in extras. Is we deep dive a little bit more and even find stuff between when we record these and when we record the actual album reviews. So
that's cool. That's shocking,
right?
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think that maybe the band themselves had something to do with that, because if they liked that type of music back in the day, they would have had no problem. And we had talked about them being kind of forced to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know that. Maybe they were happy to do it because they grew up on that stuff. Peter grew up on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Gene a little bit too. You know, he was a little more liberal in that type of, you know, that he was more open to things that were outside of the straight up rock realm, I think. I have a very hard time believing that Ace or Paul were really gung ho about a tune like that. But again, you're in the studio for the first time, an official studio. You're kind of blinded by, you know, what you have to do and what the experience is like. So I can't fault them too much.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Thanks for bringing that in.
absolutely.
Now I got to re-listen to the original
Yes,
just to see how different they are.
I don't know. We'll have to look at adding in our own audio tidbits to this at some point, and we can intersplice something like that in when we're talking about it. But for right now, I'm just going to address the fact that Bobby Rydell, "Kissin' Time," was an actual song that Kiss covered. So, and I'll be looking forward to the text that I'll get from you after you listen to it, and you're going to be like, "Oh my god!"
Well, that's funny because I like that kind of music.
I did too.
It's kind of surprising that I didn't know that. So, yes, even us old school sort of Kiss fans that think we know everything don't.
Mm-hmm. So if that's the only thing we take away from this extras, it's that we learned something new. At 41 years old and having been essentially a lifelong Kiss fan and thought I knew a fair amount, especially of the older stuff, there's always new information coming out. So
sweet. Well, let's jump into track order. I know we jumped into track order a little bit. And I think I personally would have opened the record with Deuce. We talked about that. And sort of, what are you expecting when you see this album cover? And Strutter's not a bad song by any means to start an album. But let's just pretend, okay, let's pretend that Deuce opened that and then Strutter was second and so on and so on. And they kept the same order, except they put Deuce first.
Yeah.
That seems like it would have brought a lot more energy to it, to me, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard because, again, I generally associate, I mean, there's a couple of their tracks that I'll always associate with being the openers when they're doing live shows. And, you know, Deuce is one. Detroit Rock City is another one. They, you know, their later years, they were using Modern Day Delilah from Sonic Boom as one of their openers, which, oh my God, that is in my top 3 of, that is a heavy, fun song. I love it. And I can't wait till we get to that album to talk more about that. But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, when I think of especially the early days, I'm thinking of the lights being completely out and you're just hearing that opening riff. And then it just, when those drums kick in, that pyro explosion and these guys come running out. And the thing is, I don't know that they completely had their stage show really even skeleton modeled yet. That's the hard part, is like at that time they did the best with what they had. And Paul was just kind of generally, I think, the appointed frontman based off of everything. So I guess it makes sense that he gets the first track. But to your point, I think that energy that Deuce brings in hindsight would have been, that's our trademark, right?
But correct me if I'm wrong. When they did the early shows before they even recorded the first album, or around the time they recorded the first album, didn't they open with Deuce?
I believe
like those Coventry shows that are on the DVDs and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they did. I just don't know. That's the thing, though, is so they had that, but they also had all of this material that they were recording for the first album too. So I think in there, I don't have an answer for it. I agree totally. Like it didn't make sense. Like if you're opening shows, why not open the record with that to just kind of mirror that? And again, you got to wonder how much, especially on that first album, they actually did have a say in it compared to the producers and Casablanca. But I don't know. It's something I guess I can't find any information to really explain that track order in particular.
Well, your point about Paul sort of becoming that front man and just showing, okay, let's start this show. I'm the front man. I'm in charge. Maybe that's kind of the way that they wanted to do it. And you know, that makes sense if that's the way they want the album to go. And then once people understand that he is sort of the front man and all that, then they decided to start shows with Gene. Gene, to me, I mean, they're both front men, but Paul is sort of the appointed front man, like you say.
Yeah.
So Gene to me is much more powerful as far as vocals goes, you know, in those
Mhm.
early days, I think he would probably scare the pants off you a little more if you were not ready or understanding what you were about to see.
Mhm.
You know, that sort of evil, grungy vibe that he
Mhm.
brings to it. Plus, if you watch those shows, he's jumping around like a nutball, and he's got like, you know, his makeup and his boots and the candles behind him and all that stuff. And they were all just super wild in those early days. And I imagine that show was just mind blowing.
And I think that I read that too. Gene had a story about that where he was talking about the early stage shows and how Paul still wasn't completely out of his shell, having been an introvert for a long time, just knowing that he's got the ability to play music and wants to perform, but didn't really establish it. And I believe that's how the story goes: is they were playing their first few gigs, and Pete's got all that energy in the back, and Ace is already doing his spaceman type. He's just kind of. But Paul was a lot more reserved initially. He was trying to find that, and Gene was clomping around all over, and or was it the other way? Yeah, it was that. And Paul, I think, was the one who approached him after one of the shows. Said, "You're showing me up. You got to pull it back." And I think Gene was, no, you need to come and meet my energy. And I think that was kind of the caveat or the catalyst is, thinking it, a little critical thinking. And then, the rest is history, as they say, because once Paul found that limelight, man, he'd never let go. He just never did. And he shouldn't, because he's got it. He's got the it factor.
Yeah. At that time, I imagine that was a really good comment for him to bring that energy level up and meet Gene where he was at. I that makes a lot of sense. I think that maybe was probably the case. I guess I don't know. But yeah, I mean, Gene and Paul sort of, forming that brotherhood in the beginning, it was maybe more of a challenge, and he knew he had the potential to do that kind of stuff. So pulled it right out of him.
It's fun to imagine what it was like in those years and how the band worked together, how they traveled together, how they interacted. Because people have a tendency to fixate on a lot of the negative. There's infighting and jealousy and holding each other down and certain, whatever. You're going to have that, I think, regardless. Just generally male insecurity with stuff like that, especially before it was really talked about, was prevalent, right? But it is, they're obviously, they got along generally and got along a lot of the time. But the more I read, it's fun to read more stories about how they would take turns splitting off to do different things, and how they would at times they would travel together. And normally everybody associates Ace and Peter and Gene and Paul constantly. That was the constant divide. But I'm reading more in some of the literature that I have how they did a lot of traveling where Gene and Peter stuck together, and Paul and Ace, which makes sense, the guitarists and whatever. But it just, for some reason, it's a weird, you think of that, but that was how that, and we'll talk about it later, but that's how Beth actually became, a concept for Destroyer, was the fact that Gene and Peter were driving together, and Peter was the one addressing it, and Gene was the one pushing to say, you need to bring this up. This needs to, we need to fix a few things, but this, so all of that. So it's just fun to fantasy, put yourself into that and think about what those experiences would have been like.
Yeah, definitely. And I do believe that even in the Second Coming DVD, Gene mentions that he and Peter, their personalities were much more alike.
Yep.
And he even addresses, I believe, that everybody thinks it's Gene and Paul and Ace and Peter, that split. But, he and Peter probably grew up on similar music. They both have the same sense of humor, I believe he says. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Paul is like best friends with Ace, but
right.
It just, it just clears up that there's not a split there. Right. They do have similar personalities and love for the doo-wop music and the swing and the jazz and all that kind of stuff. So really interesting stuff. Well, we could go on and on and on. We're hitting about 20 minutes here. We're going to keep these relatively short because we probably could do a 2-hour session on each of these things, going into the tones of basses, of course, and drum sounds and guitar sounds.
We're gonna get into that with Hotter Than Hell. I think that because that's going to be a big button there, is the overall production and what could have been with that album. And I'm looking forward to from the musical standpoint is your thoughts around that. So I think that's a good place to end this one and pick up Hotter Than Hell and really deep dive. And that's what I'm hoping to get out of these extras too, is little bits of trivia, but also let's deep dive and let's break apart and how it could have been, and this is just obviously armchair quarterbacking as they call it, but obviously
yeah, pretty much we're not experts by any means. So yeah, and like I say, we'll be talking instrumentation, production, album art, critical reception, the reception of
Lyrics.
each album, sales, lyrics, blah blah blah. And it might be just a little bit on each subject, or it may be a 20-minute rant of mine on basses and bass tones and that kind of thing. So it can be a rant on anything. It can be just a discussion. So this was just a great discussion today about sort of general thoughts about the album, the debut. So we'll do Hotter Than Hell next and go from there. So we appreciate your extra time if you did tune into this, and if you would like to subscribe, and possibly share, that would be great. We would like to eventually sort of get a little bit of a fan base here. Hopefully we are not too annoying to get to that point.
Yeah. Leave a comment too. We like
yes.
that.
Yes. All right. We'll see you on the next one. Check it out.
Thanks for listening.